He broke the biggest stories in New Hampshire politics and sometimes national politics for more than 40 years. John DiStaso was one of a kind, and with his passing here on Close-Up, we wanted to give him his due and hear more from some of his journalistic contemporaries whose careers ran parallel to his. Here this morning are Kevin Landrigan, State House Bureau Chief for the New Hampshire Union Leader, and Scott Spradling, former WMUR Political Director. Thank you both for joining us. And Kevin, let's start with you, since you worked alongside and competed with John since way back in the 80s. You know, what does this loss mean for New Hampshire?
Yeah, it's very significant. I mean, he obviously was one of a kind of reporter, and very much old school. Somebody who really worked very hard to get it right and get it first, and not necessarily in that order all the time. John was passionate about being first on a big story, and almost always was. And certainly that's what I'll remember most about him. But a very kind, thoughtful, decent person as well. I think that's why you're seeing so many people really heavy of heart right now. This wasn't a kind of muckraking journalist who a lot of people in the public read about, were interested in, but they didn't really like as a person. That was not John at all.
Right. He was tough, but fair and kind as well.
Sure.
Scott, how about you? What is your perspective on this? You know, what did John mean to you?
John DiStaso was the person that I looked up to and read voraciously whenever his columns came out. And so from my perspective, I see him as a journalistic role model. He was the kind of person who was able to combine that sense of basic objectivity. What is the story? Where's it going? And who do I need to talk to on and off the record to find out what's happening? But he also had a great moral compass. And I think that's one of the things that made him such an impressive force, is that he had these unbelievable relationships with people throughout New Hampshire's political landscape, and was able to turn those relationships and that trust, which is so key to good reporting, into the stories that just broke week after week after week. So he's a huge loss, but he was a wonderful role model.
And Kevin, when you think of John and big stories, there are so many going back so many years. Of course, you know, I was interested to learn, you know, that he helped coin the term Rhino, Republican in name only. This is somebody who literally changed the political lexicon of the United States.
He sure did, and that came at such an opportune time in New Hampshire, because, as you know, in the last 20 years, politics here has fundamentally changed. I mean, people almost forget now that back in the day when John began at the Union Leader, I mean, Ronald Reagan was calling New Hampshire the most Republican state in the country, and that was accurate. And now, of course, we're not only purple, we've seen a lot of very liberal politicians do extremely well here. And that's why Rhino became this, he coined this term, because so many moderate Republicans were getting elected in New Hampshire in the suburbs here, and weren't acting as doctrinaire, very conservative people. So he came up with that term. That's kind of typical John. He was always kind of ahead of the curve in terms of seeing the themes and having a vision for where politics were going in New Hampshire.
Right. And Scott, as Kevin has noted here, the competitive fire burned brightly in John DiStaso. You know, you didn't want to be the comms guy who didn't give him a scoop. That was always a fun phone call to listen to the next day. And listening him to work the phones was like a master class in source management, for sure. But can you put in context, Scott, for younger viewers perhaps, the role that the Granite Status column and then, of course, Primary Source here at WMUR played in state and first in the nation politics? Absolutely.
For young people that may not be familiar with the tradecraft, if you will, right now there are more online columns and updates and political insidery types of storylines than you can shake a stick at. But 20 years ago, there weren't that many. And John DiStaso was the leading architect and author of what the narrative was that people needed to know and what people were talking about in New Hampshire. You mentioned a minute ago his vision. And again, this is what is so impressive about the man and his moral compass and his abilities and relationships. You need all those ingredients to be a really gifted storyteller, but to be able to break news that's relevant, that might change minds, that could change the course of a campaign or a debate over a major issue. That's the influence John DiStaso wielded here in New Hampshire, but it's not something that he would speak about, and it's not something that motivated him. For him, it was about getting it right, and for him, it was about getting it first. So he set the bar extraordinarily high. This was a man who could do this kind of job, Adam, anywhere in the country, and we were lucky that he chose to do it here in New Hampshire in the first in the nation primary. He had relationships that went from City Hall of any town or city all the way to the White House. And he used those relationships, but he also had a reputation of being someone who was tough, who was not someone to be spun, and if you tried, you were going to deal with his wrath.
Yeah. Kevin, I'd like to get your perspective on, the evolution from print to digital journalism here, because both you and John made that transition. You're both honored as Lifetime Achievement Award winners by the Press Association. But if you could go back in time and speak to, the 1980s version of Kevin Landrigan and John DiStaso, it would be feel kind of weird probably if you said, hey, we're both going to end up, online and on TV. Yeah,
no, it's true. And it was very different back then. I mean, we both sort of predated the internet, if you will. So we would often, back in the day, exchange a lot of phone calls about kind of rudimentary stuff that one or the other of us might know. I tended to be more focused on legislature and bills. He'd talk to me. He'd often call me about that because, as I say, there was no way to get that information back then. And I was the same way about him. He had this encyclopedic knowledge of people in politics from the very top to the very bottom in New Hampshire. It was just amazing. So, for example, if you were thinking of somebody running for the state senate and wanted to know who the finance chairman was, he didn't even have to look at his Rolodex. He just knew this person. And that's what always amazed me about him. He had this incredible memory that he just drew upon instantly, and it made him instantaneous. I think one of the best things about John, you used the word fair, and I think this is why people in public life who dealt with John really respected him. He was not a gotcha journalist. He was not a muckraker. He did not believe in trying to catch you off guard and make you look bad with a question that really wasn't relevant. He was investigative. He broke a lot of important stories. He caught a lot of politicians doing not so nice things over the years, but he was always fair in the way he dealt with his sources, and I think everybody respected him for that.
Yeah, in some ways, I sometimes compare him in his approach to almost like a piece of heavy machinery, like a bulldozer. Like it was not going to be stopped. You knew where it was going, and it was going to get the job done, and everything in its path was essentially flattened. But Scott, how would you describe John's approach to the First in the Nation primary?
He was someone who I feel truly embodied the New Hampshire voter. He was not wowed or beguiled by anybody's reputation or national influence or what title or where they came from. That was not something that motivated or impressed him. He actually applied what I would consider the same sort of journalistic philosophy towards everybody. He gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. He asked really good, insightful, and direct questions. He understood and did his homework before putting himself in the positions. For young people, to go back to your earlier question, Adam, if you do your homework, you do your reading and you find out what makes people tick, what they stand for, and some real background, you're going to get a much more interesting and 3D shape in your interview. So he did the homework and took pride in doing that, but he did not, even though he really was the tip of the spear for so much New Hampshire presidential primary coverage, that was not the vibe you got from him. He was almost like the lunch pail, punch a time clock kind of a guy. He just knew what the work was. He did it exceedingly well. And I was honored to be able to share some time with him in the spotlight, whether it was through debates from years ago or just in the trenches of covering with him. And he was just exceedingly good, and he was a good guy. He was a good guy to be around.
And Kevin, in particular, any stories that stand out from that First in the Nation campaign trail? I know anytime, as a younger journalist, anytime we would see you or John out at something, we'd be kind of like, oh gosh, what's up? Like, got to be on my A game. But anything you remember from being out on the trail with him over the years?
Well, yeah, he was just, like Scott said, he was so fair. He worked so hard at what he was doing, and presidential candidates and presidents really trusted him and really felt like they could confide in him. I remember a particular story that is in the really good New York Times obituary about John DiStaso that ran earlier this week. I recommend people read it. The former New England correspondent, Catherine Seeley, wrote it, did a wonderful job. And one of those picks up one of those great stories where John McCain in 2007 was kind of flat on his back, had no money, was flying coach, carrying his own bags. There were a lot of national stories about McCain's dropping out. This second run for president has just crashed and burned. He's going to leave the stage, and the late Senator McCain chose to call John and give the quintessential interview to basically say, I'm going nowhere. And the Straight Talk Express is back on track. It became a huge national story, and of course, McCain went on to win the nomination.
Yeah. And Scott, as we wrap up here, what do you see as the DiStaso legacy in New Hampshire?
If you all remember, Walter Cronkite was a titan in broadcasting, and he brought the reputation of true journalism and objectivity to the profession. He inspired so many of us. John DiStaso, in so many ways, was a 20th and 21st century version of that. He was tough, but he was fair, and he leaves a true legacy of how to do the job well and how to do it right. He'll be missed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a loss for the state, and personally, I'm really going to be missed being able to walk over to his desk and find out everything that's going on in New Hampshire politics that I didn't know. And also, you know, it was just such a blessing to be able to ask him how to do the job, you know. So, Scott Spradling, Kevin Landry, we appreciate your perspective on helping us pay tribute to John DiStaso.